Transparent Anthropic Coordinate Transformation, or TACT. This is a model of consciousness and subjective experience. Specifically, the model presented here proposes how the subjective experience comes about, the experience from within the self that seems so primary to each of us that it is often called the only thing we really know, cogito ergo sum. Even though that has also been considered mysterious, seemingly separated from the way in which we derive other things about the universe and the human body and mind. The TACT model came about through studies resulting from our Consciousness and Subjective Experience series of journal clubs at the Carbon Copies Foundation, in collaboration with neuroscientists at affiliated organizations. Our research focus at the Carbon Copies Foundation is the development of whole brain emulation. That is, the ability to collect requisite brain data, to analyze that brain data, and based on that, to create a reconstruction that emulates the functions of that brain successfully with personal brain-specific characteristics. That's a scientific and technical goal. In that context, what were the goals of our Journal Club series and associated studies? A successful human whole brain emulation includes all aspects of human cognition, and of course, that includes conscious thought and awareness, as well as the subjective experience of the conscious thinker. From a more philosophical perspective, a success criterion of medical whole brain emulation, such as for a restorative neural prosthesis, is that a subjective experience must accompany instances of conscious behavior where that is experienced by persons. Or, to put it another way, we want to be confident that a whole brain emulation process cannot result in a so-called philosophical zombie, as described by David Chalmers or Daniel Stoljar. A philosophical zombie refers to the theoretical case where you have an entity that, to all external observers, behaves exactly like a particular person in a completely indistinguishable way, but that entity is completely devoid of the accompanying internal subjective experience that the original person would have. Or, as Stoljar pointed out, where there might be some sort of internal subjective experience, but that subjective experience is somehow significantly different or deficient. The other principal goal that drove our studies was the question how to identify conscious systems with a subjective experience of suffering or well-being. It's very possible that progress of artificial intelligence, as well as work on brain emulation, can lead to a world containing multiple sorts of intelligences with forms of consciousness and subjective experience. Just like we would like to minimize suffering and aim for the well-being of humans, it makes sense that we would seek the same for these other intelligences. So it's important to be able to understand the requirements for consciousness and subjective experience and to identify those who meet those requirements. The same, in fact, can apply to the non-human animals around us and to the very young or unborn children. We should not accidentally or incidentally subject conscious beings with subjective experience to unnecessary suffering. Both of the situations or cases I just described could be considered dystopian outcomes of an effort to apply whole brain emulation. Now, risks may be smaller, for instance, if it's impossible to produce perfectly successful behavior in an emulation without the accompanying subjective experience. Nevertheless, we are, of course, deeply invested in avoiding undesirable outcomes, given that the vision of the Carbon Copies Foundation is an expedited future where whole brain emulation benefits humanity and individuals. Once you begin systematically exploring the scientific literature on consciousness, you quickly notice that the authors approach the problem of consciousness from numerous directions, having multiple perspectives, priorities, and fundamental assumptions. Over a year of sessions, we tackled the most impactful selections across that spectrum while evaluating each with regard to supporting evidence and whether an approach actually tackles the core question. That isn't always the case. It's almost surprising how often authors choose to avoid or skip addressing fundamental mysteries of subjective experience by redefining terms or by shifting the goalposts, pushing questions into an adjacent domain. We also realize that many approaches or theories are closely related to one another, so that it's possible to assign them to a few distinct categories. we defined 4 main categories. In yellow, we have the panpsychist or fundamental category, where assumptions are made that consciousness is somehow fundamentally different from other aspects of cognition, not a function, characteristic, or property that can be achieved by specifically arranged calculations in circuits of neurons, but rather something that exists separately as an identifiable feature of information to greater or lesser degrees. In this category, panpsychism posits ubiquitous degrees of consciousness in all manner of objects in the universe. Meanwhile, integrated information theory, IIT, associates and declares a level or quantity of consciousness to go along with a measure of integration of information across the nodes of a graph. In green, the embodied or biological category includes theories that focus on characteristic capabilities of the instantiation of cognition and consciousness through body and brain. Genetically determined drivers of affect, mechanisms that maintain homeostasis within an organism and its brain. Sometimes also highly speculative peculiarities of the building blocks of neurons, such as in Hameroff's OR hypothesis that attempts to associate consciousness with quantum entanglement. I should probably mention up front that although brain emulation is an incredibly ambitious project, our research is almost tediously mainstream, applying Occam's razor judiciously. Consequently, I'm skeptical of quantum or field proposals for which there is little to no evidence, and I tend to stick with well-supported models of neural computation for mechanistic fundamentals of mind. In red, higher-order or self-model theories of consciousness focus on the unique requirements that distinguish conscious mental processing from subconscious processes. Finally, in blue, we find theories that emphasize the sort of information that needs to be available and the operations carried out on the information that need to be possible to explain the structure and progression through time of our conscious and subjective experience. To give a couple of examples of theoretical approaches that are unsatisfying, approaches that avoid dealing directly with the question of how conscious and subjective experience come about tend to end up describing select prerequisites and consequently seem more like theories of proto-consciousness. For example, in integrated information theory, IIT, which is surprisingly popular online in pop psych content, but not remotely as popular among neuroscientists, describes some basic requirements for the arrangement of communication channels for a conscious mind without ever presenting a model that would explain particulars of the human experience beyond the necessary integration of different sources of information. In essence, this merely redefines the terms used in information processing as consciousness, which dilutes the study and is unnecessary since we already have perfectly good terminology in information theory. By contrast, we can see the unsatisfying habit of moving the goalposts or pushing our questions away into an adjacent scientific domain in the examples of OR or electric field theories. All these approaches do is to presuppose that whatever is going on in consciousness depends on a process less studied in neurobiology and more at home in physics, without then providing any testable physics-inspired model that would predict or explain something specific about the human conscious and subjective experience. Importantly, we're also interested explicitly in models and insights that can be correlated with or connected to neural circuit function of particular brain regions and their interactions. This requirement eliminates a number of contenders. Essentially, we are left with the blue, red, and green categories. The Venn diagram on the right indicates that there's often some category overlap, depending on the specific theory in question. Because of our primary interest in functional or representational approaches that connect well with scientific evidence and derivable neural circuit models, the most useful insights come from blue and red category approaches. In particular, those appealing to core mechanisms that enable causal integration or global sharing of information across modalities such as memory, affect, vision, touch, proprioceptive input from the body, and those that carefully identify requirements for the representation of internal states. Thomas Metzinger's work is especially well thought out in these areas, which I will get into a bit more further on. In the philosophy of consciousness, there's a major distinction between two approaches. Either you begin with sensory and brain function and use a reductionist method to discover mechanisms that correlate with characteristics of consciousness. This coming from the outside in is the so-called search for neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC. Or you begin with the self-evident fact that we experience consciousness and that the experience has a certain structure. Then, working from the inside out, you would attempt to work your way towards causes. Because our research projects are about brain emulation, we naturally investigate brain architecture and mechanisms that bring about all of cognition, a reductionist and compositional method. But because achieving accurate subjective experience in emulation or neural prosthesis is essential, what we're really looking for is a testable connection between both approaches. We're looking for models that make correct predictions about the from the inside out experience and structure of subjective consciousness. A good model needs to be based in the physical, needs to carry out necessary functions, and it should explain how the experience can emerge from those functions. We assume that the brain determines the mind, which is essential for brain emulation to ever be successful. There's a ton of evidence for this, of course, from so many studies of the mental effects of dysfunctions caused from brain injuries, disease, and aging. A scientific model has to be testable through the predictions that it makes. And the sort of predictions we're interested in here are those that explain aspects of the nature of our phenomenal consciousness and subjective experience. Most importantly, it must address a most fundamental core question. If everything is based on physical mechanisms and functional, how is it even possible that we experience an inner world, that we seem to look out at the world with our inner experience seeming to be at our center, to be the most fundamental, the only thing that we can consciously have access to? This question is one of the most crucial parts of what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. Some even believe that this question is by definition unanswerable, on account of an unbridgeable separation between any kind of neural correlate and whatever it is that an experience is. Chalmers himself does not believe that it is in principle unsolvable, and I tend to agree that it's too soon to be pessimistic. An important reason why I don't think there's an unbridgeable separation is because it seems to me that when a claim like that is made, it often rests on insufficient care and investigation of our assumptions about what is deemed self-evident. The only thing we have are reports of experience, reported experience, never pure experience. Even in our introspection, realizing, checking our feelings, etc., all of that amounts to making reports, even if the form of the report is just a change of neural states. For example, by noting, I just experienced X in our working memory. We cannot ourselves tell whether we're having a pure experience or self-reporting an experience, because the process making those judgments is itself dependent on knowledge representations we generate. Speaking of experience without the term reported experience may in fact be meaningless. As a consequence, wondering what it means to be having the experience of looking out the window and seeing the world outside is a self-reported experience, and the steps in such a self-report ought to be functionally describable, not a thing separated from the functional. No one can demonstrate a pure experience that isn't a reported experience. Consider, even the moment you think about it and you think you experienced something is a form of self-report, even if just to review something in working memory, to note, check, experienced that. If it's true that there's no way to be aware of an experience without self-reporting it, then only reported experience exists in a provable, demonstrable form, even to yourself, within yourself. If we accept this claim, then why there is something it is like to be a conscious subject is amenable to functionalist exploration to the full extent of the knowledge you can have. The two images on the right here allude to such a process, pointing out how very limited our testable field of attention is, and how that can nevertheless compose a much richer report of the experience we consider in the moment. It would be very interesting to find a counterexample where you can claim experience without the same being explainable via self-reported or within self-reported experience. Let's poke a few more holes into the realness of the experience that seems so central and unshakable at every moment of the day. For starters, at any moment, we receive very limited input telling us about the world. We are in one tiny location, and at that location, our senses can detect only a small fraction of the signals that are caused by our environment and even by our own bodies. The number of sensors, individual nerve endings, photoreceptors is limited. The bandwidth within which our sensors operate is a fraction of the whole. We only have sensors attuned to a small number of different kinds of signals, for example. We are essentially insensitive to magnetism. Even our fastest neurons can only activate a few hundred times per second, meaning that we are blind, deaf, and insensitive to and unable to distinguish so many events that take place at much higher rates. Only our machines can detect those and deliver an interpretation to us much later. Therefore, our perceived and experienced model of the world has to be an imperfect, abstracted construct of reality. Like in a video game, it has to be a virtual form of reality. What we've learned to consider ourselves, our self-model, is a subset of that construct. By virtue of the knowledge available to us and the construct we generate, our own introspection can at most tell us something about those models we build. Introspection does not even tell us what information was available and included, or how the models came about from that. Metzinger likes to point out that it is as if we exist within a full immersion total flight simulation. Let's think about the relationship between the world and our conscious experience in steps. The world contains all manner of things: houses, traffic, concepts described in books, delicate flowers, the atmosphere within the crowd at a concert, expressions in the faces of loved ones, pulsars in deep space, radio signals from the ancient universe. There are signals that contain information about many of these things. Some of those signals are undetectable to us, shown here as red arrows. Some signals, the yellow arrows, are detectable and at any given moment make their way into our brains. As specialized neural circuits within our brains process electrical changes in nerves that were caused by our sensors, many layers of subconscious processing establish representations, also known as memory engrams, here shown as little groups of neurons with recurrent connections between them. And we learn relationships between them. All of this happens transparently, in the sense that we don't have conscious access to the details of these processes. A subset of these useful representations can be instantiated as and referenced by more abstract concepts of a semantic nature, in other words, meaningful, within the momentary consciously accessible world and self-models that are updated over and over again. This part of the story is presented in great detail in Metzinger's books Being No One and The Elephant and the Blind. For our TACT model, I want us to focus on the world composed of those accessible concepts. Within the universe of consciously available knowledge, these are all there is. Once there are conceptual representations with associations between them, as there must be to be able to use them in the way that we handle and work with them in conscious thought, you don't need anything else to explain the subject-centered perspective of conscious thought, the subjectivity of the experience. You don't need another extra function to carry that out, located in another special purpose region of the brain. In other words, you don't need another neural correlate that would run into Chalmers' objection. The perspective is a natural result of the graph, the implicit coordinate transformation that resembles an anthropic argument in that it naturally centers in the self-model of the human with that particular graph of consciously available knowledge is an automatic and unavoidable requirement. It must therefore seem that we are centered in a self that is looking out at the world, irreducible. And this is so different than the way science describes the world and us in it, that the two perspectives can seem disjointed, unreconcilable. A dual or dualist system of perspectives, which can, through our categorizing intuition, inspire expectations that there must also be dual natures, a mechanistic body made of components and a central irreducible spirit that is identified with self. Phenomenal first-person experience is like a full immersion total flight simulator. The phenomenal self model has to cohere to the phenomenal world model. An internal model of external reality is created using internally represented information and continuous sensory supplied input. Models are updated in real time at some time interval, granularity with some corresponding minimal delay. The transparent aspects of phenomenal experience are an invisible interface with which an organism interfaces with itself. Human brains simulate an avatar of the pilot, some of the time. The brain activates this pilot only when needed to integrate, monitor, predict, and remember its own activities. Many theories of consciousness consider a collection of requirements for consciousness and attempt to posit or measure degrees of consciousness. If we apply the requirements proposed in Metziger's self-model theory of consciousness, we can consider at least 4 consciousness levels when attempting to identify consciousness in AI, animals, children, and so forth. For minimal consciousness, without a subjective experience, representational states need to be integrated as a phenomenal now, as a single, coherent, globally available model approximation of reality. As mentioned, the processing stages that lead to the model are attentionally unavailable. They are transparent to conscious access. Earlier processing stages are attentionally unavailable. They're transparent. A level of dynamically evolving differentiated consciousness is achieved if complex situations are represented with multimodal segmentation, providing meaningful identified concepts that combine information from multiple senses and memory. And importantly, that change as time goes on, giving temporal structure to the phenomenal now that continues to track reality. We reach a level of consciousness with subjective experience when there's a distinction between a phenomenal model of the world and of the self. Which ones are part of the self model can be learned by noting the collection of concepts that always remain available or that one can always control, such as the position of arms and legs, wanting to eat to reduce hunger, etc. Such learning can also establish known relationships between self-model and world model concepts, and the relationships affect how concepts can be manipulated in working memory during conscious thought. For example, you can think, I am someone who is currently visually attending to the color of the book in my hands. We can consider an even higher level for human cognitive subjective consciousness. In this case, world and self models, concepts and relationships learned can also be used offline when they're not tracking sensory reality. This provides an ability to imagine possible states of the world and self. For example, when consciously planning or seeking a goal, a desirable future condition, or imagining and seeking to avoid undesirable outcomes, or when consciously reminiscing, recalling explicit episodic memories and reconstructing likely states of world and self in the past, or when dreaming during REM states of sleep. At this level, we can also have some conscious concepts representing a partial understanding of how some aspects of the knowledge that is consciously available to us came about. This makes some of the process a little bit more opaque and less transparent. So at this level, we have thinkers of thoughts who manage to escape the completely naive realism. I wonder, can we imagine what an even higher level of consciousness might include in some future development of mind? Now, we've talked quite a bit about processing information about the world and ending up with consciously accessible concepts. There's one more aspect of realism we can wonder about when it comes to our irreducible, self-focused subjective experience of the facts of our world. That is, does our phenomenal experience of the world as it is now correspond to the physical moment? Or is living in the now a creative illusion of sorts. Numerous experiments have tested the temporal characteristics of conscious experiences such as decision-making. The most famous one is probably the one by Benjamin Libet back in the 1980s, where EEG was used to show that the brain was subconsciously ready to act out a decision about half a second before participants were consciously aware of their decision. This led to skepticism about whether decision-making is actually under conscious control or not. Since then, there have been many more carefully designed experiments using improved measurement techniques. In 2009, Frank Charnowski's lab used neurofeedback with a sequential presentation of so-called Vernier stimuli to test subconscious versus conscious processing in visual perception. Theirs and similar work showed that how two different pairs of stimuli shown in succession are fused together in consciously reported perception and can be influenced long after their presentation of the stimuli when participants are subjected to transcranial magnetic stimulation. And the delay of that stimulation affected which Vernier pair dominated the perceived fusion. The length of time over which interference by TMS could affect reported visual perception is a strong indicator that conscious perception may take up to 400 milliseconds to complete and become part of our experience of the phenomenal now. The process also appears to be quite discrete, resulting in granular updates of what we consider the state of things now, every 400 milliseconds or so. Furthermore, evidence from studies of split-brain patients underscores that conscious awareness is a generated gist or story of what may be going on. In extreme cases of epilepsy, surgeons can sometimes reduce severe epilepsy by cutting through the corpus callosum, the dense tracts of nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the cortex. This removes much of the communication between the language-dominant left hemisphere and the nonverbal right hemisphere. These patients have been known to confabulate or make up stories to explain actions performed. For example, Michael Gazzaniga presented instructions to the right hemisphere via the left visual field or left hand. Remember, there's a crossover of sensory input. The right hemisphere processes that input and directs actions such as walking to the corner of the room. When asked to explain their action, the left hemisphere fabricates and reports a logical-sounding reason. It seems that our conscious awareness is just spinning a plausible story based on our actions and perceptions post hoc, half a second after things happened. After generating the unity or gist of an episodic memory, all sorts of creative things can happen. For example, we have almost no color receptors in the peripheral parts of the retina, and yet when we see the world, it seems like the whole field of view is in color. So, we now know that the knowledge available to conscious thought is very limited, and it is a plausible story or plausibly filled-in gist that relates to reality or to an imagined possible future or past. We also know that conscious thinking is slow and updated in granular steps. As Daniel Kahneman is famous for pointing out, reasoned decisions that involve conscious thought and making use of episodic and working memory are slow, while active decision-making is subconscious and fast. Self is illusory in the sense that it has the appearance of something that is substantive, a fact in and of itself, even though it is not a thing or a substance. The Cartesian theater that we report to ourselves is the result of these constraints. Sources of conscious knowledge are transparent, inaccessible. Self and world model relationships necessarily produce a center of gravity or locus for the theater. Conclusions, statements, and judgments in our reported experience are based on this ongoing process. Because we don't consciously know how the available knowledge got there, whatever is part of our self-model is experienced as fundamental fact that we identify with. Phenomenal selfhood is achieved not by a special kind of knowledge, but instead by a lack of introspectively available information combined with the incontrovertible confirmation of the self-model knowledge that is accessible. Returning to Chalmers' hard problem and the central question, if everything is physical mechanisms, how can there be a subjective conscious experience at all? How is there a perspectival experience of being? We can now posit that it is a necessary and inevitable result. Conscious reports are made based on the relational structure of consciously available knowledge, using relationships within a self model. There's an analogy we can make here between this origin of reference issue and the way cosmologists discuss the so-called anthropic principle. In cosmology, the anthropic principle refers to the idea that the range of possible observations that could be made about the universe is limited by the fact that observations are only possible in the type of universe that's capable of developing observers in the first place. Similarly, the range of possible experiences and consequent judgments about being, about the sense of self, is limited by the fact that these experiences and judgments can only come about in a subsystem where a self-model has been generated. And it so happens that this system is separated from moment-to-moment access to the steps of the process that does the generating. Hey, this stuff, this experience knowledge exists. I just have it. This must be me. Those other things seem somehow removed. I have knowledge that what I see is my body, so that knowledge must be me, and what I'm looking upon is somehow outside of that. This is my point of reference, and therefore the alpha and the omega. It seems like the prime mover, the source and origin, and that can lead to otherwise indefensible thinking, such as the idea that the conscious being is at the foundation of everything, and related belief systems, when in reality, something with as many prerequisites as consciousness can, of course, only be a consequence of a fairly complex system, not the origin upon which other things depend. Understanding this observation selection effect enables us to eliminate any of Chalmers' so-called further fact standing in the way of solving the hard problem. There remain no irreducible facts. Putting all this together in one slide, we have our TACT model of subjective experience. The brain transparently processes information. Some of that is creatively filled in and justified into plausible conceptual knowledge in our model of self. That is what we can self-report and identify with. The real source and process is missing, not available to introspection. Simultaneously, we have confirmation of the self-model knowledge we can report. We use the output of conscious thinking to make reporting statements, again through transparent processing, resulting in reports such as cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And if you remove all the transparent, consciously inaccessible stages, you end up with a subjective experience, where some knowledge is a given, seemingly a fact. There is a self-model point of reference necessarily at the center, at the referential center, which could not seem any different than subjective from the inside out. The resulting illusion is one that contradicts the evidence. Consciousness feels like something elementary, fundamental, at the root, when it is really in no way separated from the complex mechanistic system upon which it depends. The subjective aspect of the hard problem is addressed by the observation selection effect. Now, a possible problem with our approach is that the same principles can be applied to parts of any information processing system where that part has access to partial and abstracted outcomes. Doing so could be used as a support for panpsychism. Even the temperature report of a simple thermometer could be thought of as a subjective conscious experience of the thermometer, if ever so minimal. Personally, I don't think that is sensible or particularly useful. Remember that we're not really interested in redefining words or pasting the word consciousness onto everything around us. What we're really interested in is, why does the human experience seem the way it is? Thermometers don't have human-like world or self-models. Redefining what we're talking about just to make a model fit more things merely dilutes the discussion of consciousness and subjective experience to the point where we no longer address our important questions. I don't like diluting the precision of language. We should continue to use other terminology to describe the very different kinds of information processing. I should also be careful to point out that our TACT model does not explain every part of Chalmers' hard problem. What we explain is how the subjective perspective of our experience emerges automatically from the shallow awareness available through consciously accessible knowledge, and that this subjective experience is not explained just by proposing another neural correlate, but by the center of the graph of references between consciously accessible knowledge. Learned references and relationships that are highly useful in that they enable attention in a manner that promotes survival of the body with immediate surroundings and circumstances. For our work on whole brain emulation and its applications, this is important because it offers an answer to a very common concern. If I feel that I'm here right now, if you build me a prosthetic brain, how can I then be there? That concern is tied closely to the illusion that the subjective experience is somehow at the core and separate from the mechanistic, a dualist illusion of body versus spirit, which can lead one to imagine that the spirit aspect would somehow separately need to travel, transfer to, or enter into or infect a reconstructed brain. But it isn't a real thing. Rather, it's a necessary and automatic consequence. A part of Chalmers' points about the hard problem that we don't explain directly are the specific characteristics of what are often called qualia. For example, why in a specific context, on a particular day, redness is experienced in a certain way that seems irreducible, raw, and unique to a person. But there are hints about the realness of so-called qualia, again, suggesting that their stability and irreducible atomicity may be, at least in part, illusory. We can, again, take a step back to consider what is real versus constructed. How does anything, including qualia, have meaning? Meaning is always tied to context and to processes of encoding and decoding. For example, the tiny dots of ink on the pages of a book receive meaning only in the context of identifiable symbols and letters, interpreted by decoding within the context of language. Similarly, even the raw experience of redness takes place within a process of contextual decoding. And again, most of that process is transparent, inaccessible to conscious introspection. The redness of a sunset yesterday exists within a context. For example, an experience of romance that was experienced in association with a subconsciously perceived warm flushing of the cheeks, consciously identified as excitement. That experience of redness can be quite different from tomorrow's experience of the redness of blood and a subconsciously experienced very rapid heart rate, consciously identified as panic. Again, we can distinguish what is accessible to introspection and what is not. That this distinction can make some introspective knowledge seem grounded in no further fact, pure, raw, and central. These pieces of experience appear irreducible from within the self-modeling system. Another interesting area for further study is how our adult conscious subjective experience develops in childhood. We can wonder if stages of its development align with observable evidence from the way children refer to themselves. There tends to be a phase where children switch from making third-person statements about themselves to first-person statements, from Sally wants ball to I want ball. This could point to learning that gradually produces a stable self-model and identification within that model. Much of what has been presented here is based on evidence in psychology, cognitive science, or based on philosophical reasoning. There is, however, increasing evidence from neuroscience about quite distinct mechanisms for processing information that seem to align very well with the listed requirements for conscious versus subconscious thinking. Most brain activity takes place in the form of fast ripples of coordinated neural activity traveling along processing pathways from neural circuit to neural circuit. But there is very strong evidence for another, more granulated, rhythmic, almost clock-like, slower form of processing. The timing and granularity of this second method of processing can be aligned with regular updates of the phenomenal now. Intervals of conscious thought are strongly associated with the presence of rhythmic oscillations of neural activity at the so-called theta frequency. and that is also inextricably linked to the use of working memory. Furthermore, consciousness depends on the ability to globally integrate information across many modalities, and the evidence of rhythmic processes that accompany the use of working memory is found across all modality-specific regions of the neocortex. Synchronized maintenance and repetition of patterns of activity in a working memory buffer can support integration and a sustained context for the phenomenal now. What's more, electrophysiological recordings from neurons involved in these rhythmic operations have shown that the stable repeated activation can take place over and over again in one phase, one half of the theta cycle. Meanwhile, while theta rhythm is present during conscious engagement and in REM sleep, fast ripple activity can run through the same populations of neurons in the opposite half of the theta cycle. What you have then is a system that supports two different methods of processing concurrently, using the same populations of neurons, the same patterns of information. This leads to a model of brain-wide dual mechanisms. Our brains generate a world model simulation and a part that we come to identify with. These models are informed by our memories of various sorts, procedural, episodic, etc., as well as by motivating drives and preferences. Associative relationships are learned from habitual interactions with other parts of the world model, including what we know of others, personal social associations. Our brains also generate internal time and internal present in the form of a phenomenal now. Underlying processes are transparent. The functional architecture of the brain is such that a specific and separate type of processing supports conscious operations. These may well involve a large number of brain regions because conscious operations depend on working memory, which is temporally segmented on top of the spatially segmented specialization of cortical regions. Strong evidence and computational models point to mechanisms that can support working memory with sustained repeated reactivation of spatiotemporal patterns of activating neurons maintained in the same temporal order. Computational modeling demonstrates that this type of working memory can be achieved wherever a network-wide modulation such as theta rhythm can create a specific phases when neurons can more easily activate, combined with recurrent inhibition by so-called interneurons that prevent runaway activity and enforce continued synchronization. This way, the same sequence of patterns can happen across multiple brain regions for several theta cycles, up to several seconds. It provides a first-in, first-out updating buffer for operations that depend on knowledge of a sustained present state, something that lines up well with the requirements for a generated phenomenal now. This comes with built-in features such as sequencing, making references backwards in time, and several others that deserve their own presentation. Most importantly, these repeated patterns of activation are achieved by intrinsic mechanisms that take place independently from feed-forward synaptic flow. This effectively enables cortex-wide dual modes. One, to support transparent subconscious processing determined by the spatial architecture and connectivity of the brain. The other, to support sustained simulation of a persisting state for conscious operations that are able to integrate activity across multiple cortical regions using temporally ordered sequences. This gives us a mechanistic understanding of the interface between transparent processes and working memory-dependent processes. And the different types of mechanisms provide physically separate axes or dimensions of processing. As required, the working memory-dependent conscious processes are momentary, fleeting, and absent when unconscious. All judgments made within the space of conscious processing rely on a buffer with limited attentional bandwidth. Transparent processing is inaccessible because even the method of processing depends on different mechanisms. Statements about the content of the phenomenal now are driven by operations for which no prior cause is available. The experiential origin appears as if it is a first fact. Actually, the knowledge that informs the phenomenal now is post hoc, slightly delayed, entirely dependent on prior processing, but forms a self-centered experienced universe. Now, throughout this presentation, you've probably noticed how I keep juxtaposing how things intuitively seem against what we actually know. It's an important point to drive home because common sense intuition has this occasional tendency to confuse or mislead. Intuition and introspection are often used as an incontrovertible source of understanding about consciousness itself. Meanwhile, in the older, more mature field of physics, we've learned to be very skeptical of common sense intuitions, as indicated in the picture on the right, contrasting intuitive Newtonian perception of motion and time with the evidence of Einstein's relativistic time. Many illusions and misconceptions have shown that neuroscience must be equally skeptical of intuitive explanations. Dan Barker coined the term contraduction to complement deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. Contraduction means to invert order, whether of time, motion, position, causality, or relationship. It's an informal fallacy, and the human point of view can result in many contradictions. You could say it means fallaciously inverting the arrow of causation. For example, the mistaken belief that through subjective conscious experience, which is limited to the content of our phenomenal world and self models, we can tap into a deeper and more direct awareness of the underlying reality of the universe. What is accessible is preprocessed, filtered, and selective, with most information inaccessible to introspection. It's a shallow representation from a small pool of creatively justified knowledge. To better understand reality, it cannot be sufficient to tune out input and come into closer connection with that little pool. The limited capacity of subjective experience is also apparent in the effort it takes to actively become aware of something. It demands that we shift attention and focus. When you attend to one thing, for example a particular sound, you lose attention to another. You may have heard of the famous experiment where participants are totally unaware of a gorilla running across a basketball court because they were given the task to count bounces of the ball. An important illusion, explained particularly well by Susan Blackmore, is the illusion that we have an ongoing stream of consciousness that persists and is always available to the sense of self. That illusion is the result of sampling. For example, if you explicitly ask yourself again and again at different times, am I aware? Then because conscious operations are involved in producing the report, of course, the answer to each of those introspective questions is, yes, I am. Every sample returns a yes. Together, those samples appear to form an unbroken line without disruptions, an unbroken stream of consciousness. As Blackmore says in her talks, checking to see if you're conscious is like checking to see if the light is always on in the refrigerator. Let's finish up by summarizing our pieces of evidence. We know that manipulating the brain, as with transcranial magnetic stimulation, can disturb the world and self-models we experience. We're unable to introspect the unprocessed origins of consciously accessible knowledge. Knowledge available to conscious access is limited in both scope and precision. Subjective experience is necessarily a virtual construct. It takes some effort to become aware of something. The number of things we can actively attend to is very limited. Postdictive effects demonstrate that conscious awareness is delayed by as much as half a second. It's a story about what happened and what is. Stream of consciousness is a sampling illusion. Qualia in the traditional sense may be neither stable nor atomically irreducible. Subjective experiencing is better thought of as a process than a momentary state. What we identify as the self is learned at least in part during development. And there are dual, mechanistically separable methods of cortical processing that seem to align with subconscious and conscious mental operations. There are still many things missing, directions for future work. For example, I think I can imagine how one might design computer programs or AI to carry out individual pieces of the presented model. But really, the state of neuroscience research right now is such that we don't have neural circuit models for each of those imagined computer programs. So even if this semi-neuro, partly psychological, somewhat cognitive, and in its assumptions philosophical model is pointing in the right direction, there's still a lot of work to be done in the new neuroscience of connectomes, reconstruction, and brain emulation. So how does this model help us? Remember the reasons why we started our journal club about consciousness and subjective experience within the context of our work on whole brain emulation. The mystery of the hard problem connection between reductionist studies of consciousness and subjective structure studies and introspective common sense create an illusion of a distinction that trends towards dualism. Actual dualism, where subjective consciousness is of a distinct kind, unexplainable by referring to cognitive mechanisms, would be a potential showstopper for medical whole brain emulation. Even if the structure and mechanisms of a brain were reproduced perfectly, if the emergence could not be explained with confidence, a distinct near-spirit-like self would support often expressed concerns that post-mortem whole brain emulation would not constitute survival in the way that restarting a stopped heart does. Furthermore, Chalmers went to some lengths to explain how any theory that attempts to solve the connection by proposing yet another neural correlate would fail to do so. With this model, though, there's no newly added neural correlate. There's also no attempt to explain things away by redefining terms, or to declare the subjective experience, or even all of consciousness to be of no concern, as perhaps Daniel Dennett would have done. Instead, it is shown by necessity, by the nature and referential arrangement of the information present, that a distinct-seeming subjective experience ought to emerge automatically, given the systems that are there. To support the subjective experience, you no longer have to wonder if there might be some immaterial aspect to be concerned with and addressed separately that would not be grasped by a reductionist analysis and reproduction. The system described when operating is not a philosophical zombie. The brain, its function, memory, the representational mechanisms that enable building world and self models suffice to explain the subjective experience of being. Their analysis and reconstruction, done accurately, can suffice to fully reproduce a mind and that mind's subjective sense of existence, colored with the characteristics instantiated by that person's memory. If you're interested in the studies that led to this presentation, I recommend the authors listed here. I would also like to express thanks to my collaborators, especially Ken Hayworth and the rest of the team members at the Carbon Copies Foundation and Brain Preservation Foundation who participated in our year-long journal club. And many thanks to all of you for your patience and attention.